Please welcome Jack Friedmann.
Well, I'd like to start by saying thank you very much for Hawthorne's University of the Third Age having me here this afternoon. It's very gratifying for this 88-year-old to realize he hasn't quite passed his use-by date. I hope I won't fall into the category of one guest speaker at a Provost function who turned out to be the most boring speaker they'd ever had. And he rambled on and rambled on and rambled on until the president pulled out a revolver and put it on his lap. and the speaker stopped in mid-stride and said, "That's not for me, is it?" And the chap said, "No, it's for the guy who invited you here." So I'm not sure what level Derek Friedmann is in this afternoon. He after all brought me here. And I'm not sure after the lecture whether you want to take me home. But anyway, thank you very much, Derek, for bringing me. There is a bit of a preliminary to this talk on the question of the Air Force side. In my youth, I was at age 24 odd. I was very keen on becoming a pilot. I think it was a misplaced idea really, because the government had a system in South Africa of training people at flying training schools under a subsidized scheme. That was about 2 years before the war. So I took advantage of this and joined the flying school there. And I don't think I was a great credit to my trainers there, the instructors. I know you've heard of people looping the loop. Well, I managed to do that on the ground. I was in a bit of a different plane to the normal one, and my instructor said, "Take off," you see. And I pushed in the throttle and did a beautiful circle and stopped more or less where I'd started. And the instructor, either terrified or very annoyed, just got out of the cockpit and left me in solitary splendor there on my own. And when he didn't come back, I realized I'd better go home. So that was my one experience. Most of our training at that flying school was in what they call an Aronka aircraft. It was a little cabin aircraft with duplicate controls, and you sat side by side with your instructor. He sat on the right-hand side and you on the left, and he could take over the controls at any stage if you faltered, which I did, I suppose, quite often. Anyway, came the day, most of the pupil pilots had managed to get in solo flights by 8 or 9 hours or even 7 hours, and my instructor thought it was about time that Friedmann, with 10 hours 30 minutes to his credit, should go solo. So he got into the plane and he said, "Now you're going to take the plane off. Now just imagine that you're the solo pilot, and now you change seats with me. You are now the pilot." So I got into the pilot's seat. And now, as I explained to you, there were duplicate pedals which controlled the rudder at the back, but I didn't realize that on the instructor's side, just below the pedals, there were some extra fittings which, if you pressed down, were brakes, you see. So he said, "Righto, take off." And I started, and we weaved our way to the right starting position, and we had the throttle right in, and we were taking off. We were bouncing along, and I got the stick well back, and still we're bouncing along, and the perimeter fence is coming nearer, and all of a sudden the instructor looked down and said, "For God's sake, take your bloody feet off the brakes!" I took my feet off and we leapt into the air. Well, I have to confess, I never went solo. Well, when war broke out and I volunteered, I still had the idea of being a pilot in mind, and I went to the recruiting depot for the Air Force, and where they had a special table for those who wanted to be pilots. Well, they turned me down and said, because I'm 24, it's too old. They wanted younger chaps to be pilots. And the chap who was sitting next to me had confessed that he was 27. And when we met outside afterwards, he said, "I'm in the Air Force." I said, "But you're 27, they turned me down on 24. How come you're in the Air Force?" He says, well, I know Colonel so-and-so in the Air Force, which explains that it's not what you know, but who you know, which helps a bit. Well, in the event, I got into the Air Force, a unit of the Air Force, and the person in charge said, oh, gee, what's your category? What did you do in civilian life? I said, I was a journalist. So he said, okay, Clark, and he put it out in the car. And they sent me off to an Air Force station to do some clerical work. Well, after about 4 or 5 weeks of this, and making out forms in triplicate and chasing files from one cabinet to another, I thought, you know, in civilian life I was a key man. I didn't have to join up. And I thought, I'm doing less here than I would be doing in civilian life as a reporter and keeping the news going. So I applied to my firm and said, look, please get me out. I'm wasting my time here. Well, the next thing was the wheels were set in motion. And just a few days before I was ready to go back to civilian life, I was told, you've been posted to an operational squadron. So, well, when that came about, I thought, well, now at least I'm going to do something. So I told them to cancel the thing, and I went off to this operational squadron. Well, we were taken, just to give you an idea, you know, the South African Army at the time had some peculiar ideas about, I hope this is going to work, not that one. Oh, well, that's all right. Next one. This, believe it or not, is me in uniform, and so not a very good slide, but it does give you an indication. We had pith helmets with a back cover to cover your neck, long trousers and puttees, and this was a revolver which I don't think I ever fired in anger. In fact, I think if I pulled the trigger at the end of the water, it would squeak. And then on the other side was a water bottle. That did come in useful when it came to mixing your drinks with brandies and things like that. So this was the kit that we had on departure from South Africa. And we were taken on board a collier which had been converted to a troop ship. Now this collier had they hadn't worried about cleaning the coal dust out, so most of us were pretty filthy on board the ship. But we got to our destination, which was Mombasa initially, and from there we were taken to a camp at Nakuru. Now, you know the South Africans are pretty mad about rugby, and this Nakuru camp had elephant high grass all around our tents and all over the place, and but there was a lovely stretch of open field with this high elephant grass. And the South Africans, not to be put aside by this, scythed all the grass around to make a sizable football field. And we, of course, there was a rugby match on. I think it was the other ranks versus the officers. And one chap who got this ball on the wing, and he was dashing down, and he saw some burly forwards in front of him coming towards him. So he stepped off into the field, into the elephant grass, and disappeared from sight. You could just see the grass waving where he was running. And everybody pursued him through the grass, so you could see the grass was moving. And then he came back near the try line and dived over and said he'd scored a try. I don't know if that counted in the actual score. I was posted eventually to a squadron in the Western Desert as a bomber squadron, a light bomber squadron, and I wouldn't recommend the Western Desert, certainly not at that time, as a holiday resort. First of all, they had a most intelligent breed of flies. These chaps used to gather in hordes at lunchtime and meal times, and if you weren't very good with waving in one hand and eating with the other, you didn't know quite what sort of protein you were ingesting. So it wasn't very pleasant as far as that side. Then there was the other thing which we had, which I think I can illustrate here. No, sorry. No, seems to be the wrong way around. But anyway, also, the other thing in the desert was that we had these Hansins, which is a very heavy sort of dust storm. You can't see for yards ahead. And I'll just see if I can pick it up. Go back. No. I seem to be, I must have got the slides in as usual the wrong way around. Yes, I'm trying to find the original one was correct. Oh, well, doesn't matter, I'll try and carry on this. Yes. Well, in the Western Desert, you have these concerns and you could hardly see a yard away from tents. A man standing, I had the picture of a man standing in front with the desert sandstorm was actually obliterating anything within 10 or 15 yards behind him. And the other thing, of course, was that the German Afrika Korps didn't like us in the desert, and we were subjected to quite a few strafing raids by German aircraft, fighter aircraft would come across, and at night there would be bombing raids. And I remember one particular occasion where I sort of felt that the pilot, the German pilot, Luftwaffe pilot, had me in his sights, because he came zooming in over our tents and firing his cannon, and I just, as soon as I saw the aircraft, I flung myself on the ground, and on either side, he was just that distance away where the bullets didn't converge. He came right on either side of me, and the strange thing that the part, okay, that's the Khamsin I was talking about. That is a figure in the foreground, and although it's not a very good slide, it gives an indication just 10 yards behind that were tents, and those tents you can't see in the light. So let's see if do we go? Yeah. Okay. Then in the desert, our squadron, we never knew which direction we were going in, because the tide of war turned very rapidly, and although the Australians were able to hold on to this enclave in the western desert of Tobruk, they put up a valiant defence there, and when it came, they were called back for duties in this part of the world, and so the South Africans took over the garrison there, and this time when Rommel tried to get in, he managed to get his tanks through the perimeter defences, and on that date, in June 1942, this was a severe blow to the Allied cause, because Tobruk had been a very useful port, and had always been a source of a sort of thorn in the side of the Afrika Korps, because they could set out on attacks from Tobruk. And we were at one stage, as our squadron was stationed quite a few miles south of Tobruk, and at night we could see real fireworks, because the Germans would come over, drop their bombs, and you could see the flashes of the bombs, and also the anti-aircraft fire, tracer bullets going up into the sky, and really giving a fireworks display. Well, one night it was all very quiet, and there was no sound of attack on Tobruk, and then we heard a lone German bomber circling our airfield, and we reckoned that this have I switched off? On this south of Tobruk, we could hear this German aircraft travelling overhead, because they had desynchronized engines, and you always knew whether it was a German bomber or our own. And we had perimeter defence was conducted by what we call the Cape Corps in South Africa. They have got a sort of Cockney type of humour, and I remember this one member of this perimeter defence rushing out of his tent and pointing up in the sky and said, "Jerry, this is not Tobruk, Tobruk's over there." Waiting for him to unload his bombs in that part. Now, when quite a year or two later, when I was in Rome, we went to a, I hope this is done up. No, sorry, no, I'm afraid the slides are out of order.
No, I think you're holding them up and down too long.
Oh, I see. Oh.
They're too much higher.
Now there should be one just after that. No, that's not the one. Okay. I'll have to do that. Anyway, I think I can go on. A year or two later, when I was in Rome as a war correspondent, we were occupying an Italian photographer, war photographer's studio, and in the studio we came across the actual picture of Rommel accepting the surrender of Tobruk from the then South African commander. His tanks had managed to penetrate the outer perimeter of Tobruk, and it was a question of annihilation if they continued to fight on. So it was a surrender. This, as I say, was a severe blow to the cause of the Allied effort. And but then came Alamein, and I can never forget the night. Although we were many miles behind the front lines, we could see the flashes of the guns, and the ground, although, as I say, many miles behind, was shaking from the thunder of all these guns going blasting through the German lines. And eventually, of course, came the tide turned completely, and under General Montgomery, the Allied forces swept through to Tripoli, and the Americans came on the other side, on the Tunis side, and the Nazis were chased out of Africa. So this ended the campaign for me, and I was able to get home, and as you saw the one photograph here, that's my wife and myself married. That was the reason I went back, I think, mainly. And to my grandson who's here now, you know we were married, you see. So I've got proof of that. And then from then on, I came back to operational theatre and was posted as a war correspondent. They gave me the title of official observer, which I don't know why they said only official observer, because I had to do quite a bit of writing. And what they did is they gave me a 3/4 ton ute and a portable typewriter and some paper, and said, "You're a journalist, you're now a war correspondent, go and report on the activities of the South African Air Force." Well, I don't know if people know just the extent of the South African Air Force's efforts. We had fighter aircraft, we had both fighters firing rocket-propelled attacks. They had rockets attached to them. We had heavy bombers, very heavy bombers. We had reconnaissance aircraft. We had survey aircraft, the spotter aircraft for the artillery, who used to fly above, and we even had a MET unit which used to look after the weather conditions and report on what the pilots could expect when they went flying. Well, on my tour of duty, I decided that I would visit all these squadrons, and used to send dispatches back to Rome from where they were distributed either to war correspondents or on international news agencies would be sending the news around. So some of my stories may well have appeared in Australia, depends on the content. But I did know one thing, that it was a morale booster for people in the field, because I always invariably mentioned, if I mentioned the name of a pilot, I would say he came from Cradock or one of the South African towns, Bloemfontein or Joburg, and his relatives or family would see this in the newspaper and send the cutting back to him, and he got to know that their efforts were appreciated. And there were many stories to pick up, and I found this a delightful sort of occupation in the army, to travel from one Air Force unit to the next. But there was one disadvantage, and that was, how did I get to type my reports? And one of the places I used to try and use was an officer's mess tent, and invariably you'd have these young officers standing around drinking, and some of them would lean over me and read aloud what I was typing, and others would spill beer on my typewriter while they looked. So it wasn't a very comfortable arrangement. And I thought to myself, it would be very useful if I could only get a caravan where I could use as an office. And then the idea struck me, and I went to what they call an army vehicle, a return depot, where they had vehicles which were damaged, either blown up partly by mines and I saw the sergeant in charge of this place, and I pointed to a caravan body, and I said to him, "Do you think I could have that caravan?" He said, "That I'm not a caravan. It was a what was it? Oh yes, an ambulance. It was an ambulance. Sorry, I got mixed up. Pointed to the thing, and I said, "Could I have that ambulance over there?" He said, "Well, sir, everything over that side of the line has got to go back to base for repairs." And so I produced. We used to get our Gifts and Comforts Fund used to provide us with boxes of cigarettes. And I had a box of 30 cigarettes, and I said to the sergeant, "Do you think this will make any difference?" He said, "Sir, I'll not only tow it over the line, but I'll bring you down to your camp for you." So the next day, down came this beautiful ambulance with the front wheel missing, but the top part was all in order. And I said to there was a couple of motor mechanics at this wing where I was staying at the time, and I said to them, "Chaps, do you think you can move the body of this thing onto the back of my truck?" And they looked at me and said, "No, sir, it'd be very, very difficult." And I said, no, I went to my truck, and we used to, as officers, used to get a bottle of brandy a month. And I came out with this bottle of brandy, and I said, "Do you chaps think this will make any difference?" They took one look at the bottle and they said, "Yes, sir, we look after it, you see." So a couple of days later, I came along, and there was this body of this ambulance mounted on the back of this truck. I'll try and show it to you at the end. Mounted on the back of this truck. And not only that, but these chaps must have been so enthusiastic about the brandy that they fitted up a water heating system inside my caravan. It consisted of one big drum and a smaller drum inside which contained water. And they had a small petrol tank outside with a tap on and a little copper pipe running into the main drum. And the idea was you turned on this tap to allow one drop at a time to come in, threw a match inside, and you had a flame going, and why it never blew up, I don't know. But it gave me lots of hot water all the time I was in. And what's more, it heated up the caravan and made it very, very, very comfortable in winter. And then in visiting the squadrons, I was eventually talked into, or maybe I thought I should do something about it, to get something of the feeling of the air crews. So I went on a Liberator bomber attack on the northern part, bombing attack in the northern part of Italy. Well, they say that was the most nervous war correspondent they've ever seen, because I was trying to plug my oxygen into the intercom section and vice versa, until somebody helped me out. And I was given a position of rear left gunner at the back of this huge aircraft, and I actually didn't fire in anger, but I tested the gun, and that's about all I did. It was the most interesting experience, even terrifying, because on either side of you were the anti-aircraft guns blasting away from this big marshalling yard. Preceding our bomber, it was what they called the Pathfinders. They used to fly over the area and drop flares to light up the area which had to be bombed. And they sort of marked that out fairly well. So everything was lit up below. We could actually see the marshalling yards and the bombs going down. And anyway, we got back quite safely. But I was very lucky that I'd chosen to go on this particular aircraft, because a friend of mine called Arthur, who was in also a Liberated pilot, he'd said, "Why don't you come with me?" And I said, "No, I've already made arrangements, I'll go with this crowd." So I went with them and came back, as I said, safely. Now his plane was jumped by a German night fighter, and bullets were pumped into this actual position I would have had in his aircraft. So if I'd gone with him, we wouldn't have had this lecture today. I don't know whether that's a blessing or not, but anyway, this was a lucky escape in that sense. Now I'll convey a little story later, but Arthur was very kind enough. I went into his tent, and he was. We used to get this rather greasy margarine, and he had a tin of Australian butter actually. It was Australian butter, and he saw me looking at it longingly, and he said, "Look, Jack, you're travelling around. I'll give you this tin if you can replace it." Well, to carry the story a bit further, when the war ended, Arthur was also a fellow Cape Town. He lived in Cape Town, and for years he used to pass me in the street and say, "Jack, where's my tin of butter?" And this went on for a long time. Then eventually I thought I must do something about it. So I got in touch with the a dairy board here in Australia at the time and asked if they could provide me with a tin of butter. I didn't get any joy there. And then, just by chance, I'd met the sales manager for the South African Airways, which was flying to Australia. And I said to him, look, do you think you could organise a tin of Australian butter for me? So they said, sure, I'll get one of the pilots to get it for you. So he sent through a fax, and in due course this tin of butter arrived. Now Arthur was in the advertising agency, and this sales manager had arranged to have this tin of butter at his office. So I phoned Arthur and I said, Arthur, the South African Airways want to see you about something. Will you come down this afternoon? And of course I was there, and I was able to hand over his tin of butter 29 years later. So he got his tin of butter back. Well, on these the Liberators were huge aircraft, as I say. I plucked up courage the next day or two later to fly with a friend of mine. Well, he was actually an office colleague who was the pilot of this Liberator. And for once in my life, I was able to control an aircraft. He gave me 3 minutes at the controls where I moved this huge aircraft up and down. What happened on this particular raid, they were told that if they didn't see the target area, which might be covered with cloud, they should drop their bombs over the sea. Well, the bomb aimer in this particular aircraft through a hole in the clouds thought he saw the target, which was supposed to be German headquarters in some buildings in the North Adriatic, and he let his bombs go. But when the photos were developed later, they showed the Hitler fishing village, which had nothing to do with it. So unfortunately, their bombs were dropped in them. Well, I left the bomber wing that the next day, and somebody told me later that at the following briefing, the commanding officer said, now listen, we've been told to drop your bombs over the sea if you don't find your target. He says, you don't have any pressmen with you now to impress, so do the right thing this time. So apparently I had some impact on what... Well, in the course of my visiting various squadrons, I thought that having gone on the bomber squadron where there was room to pick up a correspondent, I thought maybe I should go to a fighter squadron and watch their activities. And it's perfectly safe because you stand on the control tower and watch these chaps taking off. Well, now at that stage they decided to fit these fighter bombers, turn them into what they call fighter bombers. They put 500-pound bombs under each wing, and these pilots would then take off, drop their bombs on the target as they fly. And I was standing on the control tower watching one of these planes take off with its bombs. And unfortunately, this pilot lost a bit of control. The tip of his aircraft caught a parked aircraft on the side of the runway, and the bombs fell off. Now I'm standing on top of the tower, and I see 2 bombs rolling towards me. Well, I was down the stairs of that control tower as fast as I could, and was lying flat on the field. And then I looked, and there was this American sergeant lying next to me, and he said, "Sir, you sure came down them steps fast?" He said, "Your feet never touched." Talking of American pilots, they had an amazing crowd, Negro pilots, who they were the most incredible people. You know, they'd talk on the radio, and when they were supposed to maintain silence. And the story goes of one fighter pilot calling up his commander and saying, "Leader, I must go," which means I must get back to base. "I got a glycol leak." He says, "You ain't got no glycol leak, you just yellow, stay in the formation." And the other incident I came across was, the aircraft were fitted with identification equipment, so you switched on and your ground station knew that it was not an enemy aircraft, but it was a friendly aircraft. And this one Negro pilot had forgotten to switch on his identification equipment, and he was circling around very happily high up in the sky, and the ground station picked him up, and the radar, and they said they got a Spitfire pilot to take off and chase this chap and see what he was, you see. And they called them bogies, any unidentified aircraft was called a bogie. And this chap happened to be listening to his ground radio, and he heard the voice come up, 20,000 feet bogey, there should be a bogey, 20,000 feet to your left, whatever it is, gave the command. And he looks in his rear view mirror and he sees a Spitfire bearing down on him, and he shouts into his microphone, "I's no bogey, I's a citizen of the United States of America." From fighter squadrons, I did visit one of the Bow fighter squadrons. They call them the Whispering Death because they could come over a target very silently. You didn't hear them. They were twin-engine aircraft, not jet-propelled or anything, but they could come very quietly over a target and straf them with their rockets. So they offered to take me on one flight, although it was virtually a two-seater aircraft. And then they just mentioned the fact that the previous time they'd taken a journalist along, he hadn't come back. So I said, no, thank you. And then I eventually heard about the South African squadron on Gibraltar. It was doing sea patrols, and I thought, well, I'd go and see what they were doing, and through air transport I got to Gibraltar. And while there, I said to the chaps in the squadron, look, is there any chance of me getting to London? I have a brother there, and I hadn't seen him for 3 years. He was a war correspondent with the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. He was also the London editor of the Press Association, and I was rather anxious to see him, and I thought, can I get to London? And they said, no, sir, not a chance, no luck. Well, as it happened, from my headquarters in Rome at that time, I got a cable saying that there was a parade taking place the following day with the South African squadron for the first time taking part in what is known as the peace ceremony on Gibraltar. I don't know if it's done today, but even in wartime, they were having every evening. They had a parade, and the keys of the gates of Gibraltar were handed to the governor, who was supposed to theoretically lock the gates, big wooden gates, and that was the thing. It was the first time the South Africans were taking part because they had the squadron on Gibraltar. So I was asked, and the cable read, please send report, and then they had the magic words for broadcast. So I thought this was too good an opportunity, and I took this cable up to the movement control officer on Gibraltar and said to him, you can see I'm going to do a broadcast about this thing tomorrow, this parade tomorrow. The quickest way I can do that broadcast is to get to the BBC in London. So he said, certainly, sir, made out a route form. The next day I was on my way to London, where I actually met my brother, who'd just come back from the United Nations. Now, I'd just like to say a word or two about my brother. He was a remarkable journalist in every way. He never missed a story, and I cite this one instance of his, he was what you call a rather contradiction in terms. He was a journalist of integrity. If he was ever told a story by somebody and said that's off the record, as far as my brother was concerned, that was off the record. He never published an item which he wasn't allowed to do. And he was one of the very first journalists to know about Hitler's extermination camps. What happened was that because he had the confidence of British ministers while he was in London, he was called to the office of a British minister who said, look, I'm giving you this story. You're not to reveal its source in any way. Just say you understand, or you've heard, or you know, but your message must... And he gave him details of these death camps, what was going on there. Well, my brother cabled the story to South Africa from the information he got, sufficiently clothed in the language that the chap had asked him, the minister had asked him to do. And you know that in South Africa they couldn't believe it. And hardly a newspaper published the story. They turned the story down. They couldn't believe that a nation could do this sort of thing, gas chambers and all the rest. And the reason why this British minister was so careful was Britain had spies in these camps, and they were able to feed back information. And the minister didn't want to jeopardize the chances of these chaps being taken up as spies. So if it came from official sources, they'd know there were spies in the camp. So that was one story. Another occasion, both my brother and I were on the same story at the time. We were welcoming Amy Mollison, the famous flyer, aviatrix. She was coming to land at Cape Town from London to Cairo flight, I think, London to Cape Town flight. And we had a group of journalists, we were all standing on the tarmac, and the plane landed, and as the plane taxied up to the group of journalists, she said, "Just excuse me, call of nature, I've got to run to the ladies." So she jumped out of the plane and rushed off to the ladies' toilet in the airport buildings. And my brother very quietly followed her, and he had an interview with her over the toilet door. He got the scoop. That sort of illustrates the man who never let a story go, but was at the same time very careful to see that what he had published was correct. Well, having got to London, my object was I thought I'd better do a broadcast to justify my being there. So I got in touch with the BBC, and they allowed me to describe this keys ceremony with the South African, and the story was beamed to South Africa. And now I had to get back. I was there unofficially, and how did I get back? You see? So I went to a cinema one afternoon, and seated in front of me was I could see the South African Air Force. South Africans used to wear red tabs. If you were outside the country, it was a change in the Defence Act. South Africans were only supposed to fight in South Africa, but if you volunteered, you had this red tab. So I saw these red tabs in front of me, and I tapped one chap, and he turned around, and I saw he had a pilot's overall warnings. And I said, "Are you chaps by any chance going back to Italy?" So he said, "Yes, we're going tomorrow." So I said, "Can I have a lift?" So he said, "Yes, sure thing." So the next day I was on my way back to Rome, and strangely enough, they kept this the recording they made of me for a day, and so I was able to hear my own voice coming back from London with this report on this keys ceremony at Gibraltar. Well, with the end of hostilities, and I actually have a copy of Eisenhower's message to the troops to ceasefire would take place from 11 a.m. or whatever the time was, and also warning people that some of the German units may not know that the war is over, so take every precaution. So this virtually terminated the. Now I forgot to mention, while I was on Gibraltar, the local crew there, one of the local crews who were out in reconnaissance, they picked up what they thought was a German submarine, and they challenged it, and there was no response. So they dropped depth charges, and it turned out later from photographs that this was a poor old whale, you see. Wow. It was a very sad story, but obviously quite an error. Well, some years later, when I was back in South Africa, I attended a wedding, and the father of the bride wasn't well known amongst the company at the wedding, and they said to me, "Look, Jack, you were in the Air Force, he was in the Air Force, go and have a chat with him, and make him feel at home, you see." So I went across to him, and I said, "What squadron were you with?" And he said, "Oh, I was 26, and I said, "Oh, that was Gibraltar." He said, "Yes." And I said, "There was some stupid crew that went out there and found a whale." So he looked at me very sheepishly and he said, "That was my crew." Well, I don't know if I've covered all the fields, but I must say it was the most interesting and extensive experience the latter end of the war, with instead of having to jump into slip trenches, here you were driving in comfort around the country with the only disadvantage of my caravan was that I found that it was such an unusual thing at the squadrons that chaps used to come along and climb into my caravan and drink up most of my beer, so it wasn't such a good idea in that respect. But for the rest, it was very comfortable. You might ask, how did I come to furnish this? Well, in the areas I travelled, there were, a lot of houses were flattened in bombing raids, and the owners would never come back, or maybe they were killed, I'm not sure. But you go into a house and I found a desk and a bed and a chair, and so I was able to equip my caravan, and I still to this day wonder what happened when at the end of the war you had to hand in your vehicle. They must have said, "Now, this was a 3/4 ton ute. It come to be like this. So that is basically my story of the war coverage. To my great regret, I didn't keep the stories that I wrote. I have one published, one in a book that was published, but a lot of my stories I kept in a file, and I handed them to the South African Air Force Museum in Cape Town, so that anybody who was looking up history of the war or anything could have some background. So those stories are contained there. But I must say there were numerous stories of very, created quite considerable interest. A big one was the raid on Warsaw. It was a political move. They wanted the Allied air forces to drop supplies to partisans in Warsaw. And on the one side of the aerodrome were the partisans, on the other side of the Germans. And I met a pilot of one of these aircraft and said when they came in ultimately, they were fired on by both sides, the Germans and the partisans. They didn't know. They thought it was each of them thought it was another aircraft. And so these chaps. Now, one of the navigators on those pilots, he survived. His plane crashed. He was taken prisoner, and he told me that his plane was on fire from all the ground fire. And as they crash landed on Warsaw Aerodrome, the crash put out the flames, and they were able to get out. But the Germans captured them, and he spent a time as prisoner of war. Well, I didn't know about this fellow. But in my civilian life, I went back to parliamentary reporting in Cape Town, and one of the senators, I got chatting to him, and somehow I just mentioned that I'd been doing wartime coverage, and he said, oh, I was one of those liberators that crashed in Warsaw. So I knew something of the story, and he told me that he survived the war and was taken back to Britain, eventually released after the war. So it was quite a strange coincidence that I should have met this chap. Now, I don't know if there's any questions you'd like me to answer or anything that is specific. Yes?
Yes, I want to know, I was born in Britain and my aunt was in Belsen. I can remember as a child knowing something about the fact that something was happening to the Jews in Germany. But of course I was a child and I wouldn't have known what year. What year was it that these rumours came out about what was happening to the Jews?
I should say around about 1942, round about there. I'm not quite certain, but I know my brother was called in for the story. As I say, none of the newspapers in South Africa would believe it. They thought it's impossible that a civilized nation can descend to this sort of thing. But as I say, he was given it in confidence, and he never betrayed the confidence. So he had to just stick by his story. But the strange thing is, about 4 or 5 months later, some refugees who'd escaped from Germany and got into Switzerland were able to tell the story. So my brother was vindicated there. He had another incident where, he wasn't a man who could be talked into something when it wasn't feasible. And he was just after the Battle of Arnhem. Montgomery called in a very hasty meeting of the press. He said to them that I'll have the boys home by Christmas. Now my brother had been around some of the front line areas, and he knew that the supply lines and everything that was involved made it impossible for them to be home by Christmas. So he challenged the story. He said what Montgomery said, and then put his own version based on what he'd heard from commanders in the field. And now he was also confident of our then Prime Minister General Smuts, and General Smuts queried this story about my brother. He asked the editor, the press association, is this story correct? My brother, not got things wrong. And he said no, he was quite certain that my brother had the right. And about 4 months later in Parliament, in the British House of Parliament, the Prime Minister Churchill announced that the boys would not be home by Christmas. It would take longer until March, he said. So my brother again was vindicated in this story.
Can I ask 2 other questions? What part, if any, did the Negro people play in South Africa in the war?
Well,
and did they ever get sent out of South Africa?
Yes, yes.
And when was the year when the partisans and the Germans were fighting in Warsaw?
Sorry,
What was the year that the Germans and the partisans were fighting in Warsaw?
When they came in, that was just, I think, just at the end of 1941. It must have been after they made the pact with Russia. As far as blacks in South Africa were concerned, we had the what they call the sort of coloured race, the Cape Coloureds. They were given perimeter guard duties. They actually carried arms. The blacks were sort of batmen and did the work. They were, sort of the sort of old traditions that remain. The apartheid hadn't been introduced. They were given the same sort of status in the army that everybody else got. They got paid the same, I believe, but they had specific functions, guard duties. And I know the Americans, of course, the Negro pilots were splendid in uniforms, and these chaps used to, just have their ordinary great coats, and they weren't as smart as the Americans. And I remember there was an American, tall American Negro pilot standing, and he saw this South African Negro standing next to him, or black standing next to him, and he looked at him and he said, "Where's your assegai, Bo?" Sort of thinking that he must have an assegai. But they were good. There's one interesting story about one black chap who was used by the Germans when to load ammunition into Brook, and he very skillfully arranged for one of these ammo ships to be blown up, and he was recognized for this after the war. He was then a prisoner of war, but he was recognized after the war. But unfortunately, with the apartheid regime in South Africa, which I don't intend to spend time on now, but that changed the status of what was going to happen. Smuts had come back from the United Nations, and he said that South Africa has to change its policies. But unfortunately, they changed them in the wrong direction when the new government came in. So that's basically it. Any other questions?
May I suggest that I'm sure you've got some very interesting film to show, and even if they're out of order,
yes,
perhaps you could show them and just comment on each one.
I find slides for you, and then you say what they are.
Yes, sure. Well, this is to prove that I did get married. I went home to South Africa. My bride, 60 years standing, would have been here today to keep an eye on me, but she's unfortunately in hospital and recuperating well at the moment. So this is the start of the Italian. We can move on to the next one. Now, this is the area that South Africa was largely. We had squadrons all over Italy, from right down in the south, heavy bombers there, bow fighters there, and then we had over in Gibraltar on this side, we had the sea patrols, and then we also had transport squadrons flying across here. So it's quite an extensive area of coverage. If you'd like to show that next one. These are the mechanics who built my caravan. You can see in the background the ambulance body, and the back door of the ambulance, well, that was really the front door of the ambulance linking the driver's seat, and that was turned around the other way, so the main doors of the ambulance were flush up against the cab. Have a look at the next. And this is the actual ambulance itself, You can see the caravan that's mounted on the body of the truck, and very secure. It never came off, and I had no trouble with it at all. And I used to drive everywhere, but and I could at least do my dispatches in comfort. This is the apparatus that heated my water system. There was a petrol tank outside, an outside drum, and an inside drum with a tap leading off into a wash basin. Incidentally, I would make a confession now. That wash basin comes out of Mussolini's girlfriend's home because, you know, in the army I don't sort of liberate things, as they say. I didn't much respect the property there, and I needed a wash basin. I just took it off the wall. That's the one that's there. That basin. Okay, we'll have a look at the next. This gives you an idea of a Liberator bomber. It's I would have had a position somewhere at the back there as a rear gunner, and you can get an idea of the size of the aircraft from this is an individual standing in front here, so you get some idea of how big they were. And that is more or less the chaps with jackets on are the crew, and some of these are mechanics, so it takes a lot to maintain and fly these Liberator bombers. They did a wonderful job actually. They did mine laying, they did bombing raids, and also later on served to convey personnel back to base. So it was they were based right down in the south of Italy in Foggia.
Are you in that photo?
No. Now this is quite an interesting photo. All three of us are members of the Press Association. The little one perched on the jeep there is Harry O'Connor, who was he's got an Australian connection in this sense that his two sons work on the Age. Both of them, one I think was one time was editor of the Sunday Age, and the other's a sub-editor on the Age. And Harry was, even though he's sitting there high, he was a very small chap, and the local Italian population called him Piccolo Correspondent. So that is it. The other thing is that Charles Morgan is the one I flew with on the day raid when they dropped the bombs where they shouldn't have. And of course, it won't recognise me, but that's me. Okay, next one. Oh yes, this shows, if you can pass on to the next point. This is how I used to do my interviews. That's me at the lot, and two pilots telling me of their experiences. Some of them had amazing experiences, chaps coming down in the sea and being rescued by other ships and things like that. And as I say, a lot of these stories did them a lot of good because they went back to South Africa, and the people there would be proud of them and send back cuttings and that sort of thing. This is the keys ceremony. A whole lot of soldiers marching, as you can see there. I'm afraid the governor there is taking the salute as the South Africans go past. You have the next one, which will show. That gives you an idea of the parade. They even had mounted horsemen, and the troops lined up eventually for when the keys are about to be handed over. I'm not sure if the ceremony still continues today, but it certainly was a daily occurrence in wartime. Give you an idea of the size of the keys. Those are the keys, and this is the chap here, one of the sergeant who was accompanied by two riflemen, presents the keys to the governor. So that's the. Okay, I'll try this. This is my brother as a war correspondent. I'm sorry the slides haven't come up very well, but you can see he's in his war correspondent's outfit, and he kept the news flowing to South Africa from London despite the blitz. His own flat was flattened in a bombing raid, left him with only his clothing that he was standing up in, but he maintained and the big thing was he had the confidence of a lot of ministers, so he very often got stories which they might have even been denied in South Africa and later proved to be correct. So, I just wanted to mention the signal from Eisenhower again. It's quite historic because it gives all the detail of, and this is the tin of butter being handed over after 29 years.
I went off mine, I was expecting to see the signal from Eisenhower.
Yes, unfortunately the signal didn't produce very well. I did have it on a slide, but yeah, you could hardly read it, so I could only just tell you. I should have brought perhaps a copy along and read it to you. But it says, you know, hostilities have ceased from such and such a time and day, and just warning people about they have to lay down arms, but at the same time take care that German units which hadn't been advised or may not have known about it might still continue fighting. So that's the last one, I think. Okay. Well, I thank you very much for your attendance.
Derek, I thought there was another question over
Yes,
there.
indeed, originally in wartime.
I think there's another
Australia
question.
had, it was definitely an Australian thing, but
Was it made in tins to be sent overseas?
I think that was the idea for the troops. I think it was meant for the troops. Strangely enough, the South African units never had that, but this chap had picked it up from an American supply store, so maybe from America, but it's definitely Australian. Yes, no, well, they probably didn't make it for the public, general public. To preserve it, I think they sent it in tins overseas.
Any more questions?
I wonder to what extent censorship applied to the stories you sent.
Oh yes, there was definite censorship. You got to know what the censors would look for, and you left it out of your copy. If you very seldom that after a while you got to know that if you gave away positions, but they didn't mind stories about individuals, and that was quite a lot of stuff I could write about. Anything that was, of course, pro-war effort, showing how gallant our people were. That went through without any trouble, but there was an occasion where they might slip a bit out, or and as an officer, I was, most letters that the troops sent home were censored, always, and they would cut bits out or put a pencil through some stuff if it gave away any vital information. But as an officer, I didn't have to have my letters censored. I was allowed to send my letter, so to some extent that would have covered. But you more or less knew what the censors would be looking for. You couldn't give away detailed positions of units or identify people who were possibly capable of getting a lot of information to the enemy. Who'd been taken prisoner of war and that sort of thing. So, but by and large, that was. Most of my stories went through. And I've got, as I say, it's a pity I didn't keep them, but I thought it might be an idea to give them to the Air Force Museum. Somebody who's doing research could find quite a bit. So that.
Would you like to explain the wording of that?
They always said when Friedmann gets involved in anything, it's going to take a lot longer than
We found this slide.
Oh yes, this slide was just a test slide. It's I think it's one of the Roman cathedrals. I think. I'm not sure. It might be. I'm not sure which one it is.
Looks like a pen.
But it's definitely one. So that's it. Well. No, you don't need to look at that again.
There's one question over there, Jack.
Yes. Oh yes. Sure.
What could you say about the Italy of the time that you were in, the Rome or the Bari or the?
It was quite fascinating because I don't think the Italians really wanted war, and by and large you were generally, as occupation troops, you were made very much at home. As I was about to say at the start, you had the modern warfare where the correspondents were embedded with the troops. And I say that most of the war correspondents, or I won't say most of them, but quite a few of them were embedded with their girlfriends. So, no, Italy was a very beautiful country, I must say. It was, apart from the devastation of war in various areas, but by and large, I mean, Rome was untouched, they didn't bomb Rome. And I think the Germans respected it too. They got out of Rome as quickly as they could when things weren't going well. It's quite interesting, one doesn't see the other side, but one of our functions in South Africa was also with the next servicemen's organisation there. I used to get various guest speakers to come along to our meetings. And one of the guest speakers was the Luftwaffe fighter pilot, and I got him to come and talk to us, and he actually flew over the invasion fleet, and he said he was absolutely terrified because his petrol was running out and he didn't know whether he'd make Germany, and he didn't want to crash in the sea in the midst of all these Allied ships getting ready to go to Dunkirk. So, and you get the sort of feeling, same sort of feeling, triumph when they do something wonderful, and despair when things go bad. And they did go bad for them, and he said eventually he just abandoned his uniform and went back to his hometown. So you get it on both sides, you know, which is the futility of war. You really don't want it or need it.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'd like to ask a terribly simple question, perhaps a silly question. I've actually seen letters that have been censored.
Yes.
And I've been impressed with the fact that those little cutout bits are so tidy. Do they actually have something, or did they just use a little razor blade?
I think they must use a razor blade. It will probably fit it into because it's cut out on there. I've seen
It's
those letters too.
unbelievably neat, yeah.
Really neatly. So just the word is taken out, but it's done with. It's probably a fitted, either a very sharp knife or a fitted razor blade. I think it must be a razor blade that's fitted.
And you think that there's just individually?
Yes, in some instances they used to use black ink and mark through.
Well, I've
But
seen
I know
that.
there were quite a few that were cut out that way.
Anyone else? Well, that brought this to a close. I'm hoping you're going to be able to lengthen it a bit, Jack, the way you had to lengthen the wall. But it's clear that we don't need a revolver. Thank
I'm much relieved.
Thank you very much. It's a little gift for you.
One more question. Do you have a national day like we have Anzac Day?
Yes, oh yes. Our big day is Delville Wood Day in South Africa and Armistice Day. Delville Wood Day commemorates World War I effort where,
Like Anzac Day.
yes, you know, it's like holding on to a wood that the South Africans were mainly responsible for. And they kept defending the Germans in this, and they went in with, I don't know what the actual figures were, but they were something like 2,000 men went in, and only about a couple of hundred came out, you know, who weren't wounded or killed. So they held the line there.
What was the date?
16th of December 1916, I think it is. Quite interestingly enough, I was at sea with a group of, we had an overseas travel for ex-servicemen, and Delville Wood Day fell on while we were at sea, and they had a full ceremony for Delville Wood on the ship, and they threw wreaths into the water as the ship sailed on. You know, quite impressive.
One of the things which can happen where you get two people in love and they're writing letters to each other during the war, they sometimes, a young husband or something, will not realise the danger if they write to try and tell their wife where they are. Remember where the flying fishes play. They're trying to tell them, you know, that piece of music we used to sing, they're telling them they're in Mandalay or something like that.
Yes.
It may not get picked up by the censor, but a German or Japanese or whatever might pick that up and know and possibly...
Yes, there is a possibility of that, but, you know, the censor very often is just an ordinary officer, reads through it and maybe doesn't sink in.
Yes. Yeah, and the person that's trying to tell their wife where they are doesn't realise the danger that they're putting the whole
right.
unit.
Yes, you can put a whole unit in danger. It very often when they took prisoners of war, they used to examine their their tickets and things that they found, tram tickets or anything they found on them, which identified where they came from and where the unit might be based, you see. So they compiled this. But that's the basis of it.
Did you ever do any censoring yourself as an officer?
Very little. I didn't do very much. Just wanted to. In fact, most of the chaps I had to deal with, I used to say to them, you know, with the scorers, you don't give away any positions. As long as you stick to that, I'm not going to cut out much of your letters.
I was in charge of a small radar unit during the war, and one of my tasks was censoring, and
You know, as you said, a lot of the troops were running lovey-dovey stuff to their sweethearts and boys
Yes,
and so forth.
it's a bit embarrassing, isn't it?
Once or twice I heard grumbles, you know, he's reading all the old letters. I assured them that as long as I saw all that stuff, I just passed straight over it. Didn't have time to read before.
Yes. I don't know if I can tell the stupid story of the chap who wrote back to his parents in America and said, I can't tell you where I am, but I shot a polar bear. And then a bit later he wrote, I can't tell you where I am now, but I danced with a hula hula girl. And he said, I'm in hospital, and they said I should have danced with a polar bear and shot the hula hula girl. Anyway, thank you again for listening to me.